Send your men down at once. Do you hear me?
Governor Weatherby Swann, it's been too long.
Cutler Beckett.
He's Lord now, actually.
Lord Cutler Beckett, Supreme Head of the East India Trading Company and duly appointed representative of King George II, a cunning businessman and a cold and calculated manipulator. In the Pirates of the Caribbean universe, no person is heralded as much global transformation as Beckett. From his humble roots as the son of a well-established merchant, to a powerful slave trader, to becoming the leading force in taming the new frontier of the pirate-infected Caribbean Sea, Cutler Beckett is undeniably the one character who's undergone the most growth in his influence. For me, he's one of my favorite final villains in storytelling, pulling the strings and forcing our heroes into situations that really test their resolve. And so, to honor this cruel and uncaring agent of conquest, I'll be discussing all of the potential historical inspirations for Lord Cutler Beckett. In order to understand the intricate web of influences behind Cutler Beckett's character, delving into the inspirations behind the fictional East India Trading Company is paramount. Established in 1600, the East India Company wielded immense power, controlling trade routes, amassing wealth, and even forming its own army. Its reach extended far beyond commerce, influencing politics and shaping the course of history. Just as the rest of Western Europe at the time, England had an insatiable desire for Eastern goods. Jewelry, tea, and spices were the driving force behind this, and specifically, in regards to spices, this was needed to make survival easier. Spices can ward off bacteria, which slows down the expiration of meats. So of course, growing empires need to fuel their populace with more and more food. As such, this growth in demand necessitated the existence of a trading monopoly to transport goods for one of the most thriving economies in the world at the time, India. In December 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the newly formed English East India Company, giving it the exclusive rights to trade in the East Indies. This was England's attempt to counterbalance the dominance of the Dutch and Portuguese in the Asian spice trade. Its early years were marked by the establishment of trading posts and the formation of alliances with local rulers. As the company grew in power, it increasingly resorted to military force to expand its territories and control trade routes. This aggressive expansion involved numerous conflicts and actions that would now be considered war crimes. For instance, during the conquest of Bengal, the East India Company's troops, led by Robert Clive, engaged in the looting of the Bengali treasures and the manipulation of its political landscape, which directly contributed to widespread famine. By the 1700s, the company had transformed significantly, controlling large territories and operating its own armed forces. The use of these forces was often brutal. In the suppression of uprisings, company troops committed massacres, such as the notorious Black Hole of Calcutta incident in 1756, where a large number of Indian protesters were confined in a small dungeon overnight, with the vast majority dying due to suffocation and heat exhaustion. The company's administrative policies also contributed to widespread suffering. Its revenue system and land reforms stripped many local farmers of their rights and livelihoods, leading to immense hardship and several famines. The most catastrophic was the Great Bengal Famine in 1770, where mismanagement and aggressive tax policies imposed by the company exacerbated the famine conditions, leading to the deaths of millions. The company's rule came under increasing scrutiny years later. The brutality of its suppression of the Indian Rebellion in 1857, which included widespread atrocities such as summary executions and population displacements, shocked the British public. This rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, involved significant violence on both sides and highlighted the East India Company's cruel methods of maintaining control. In response to the rebellion and the outcry over the company's governance policies, the British government took direct control of India through the Government of India Act in 1858, effectively dismantling the company's administrative powers. The East India Company was finally dissolved in 1874. Now, one big thing the films pretty much made up was the idea that the East India Company had an extensive presence in the Caribbean Sea. In the Pirates of the Caribbean universe, we also learned that Beckett had his hands in the transatlantic slave trade, something that was covered by the Royal African Company in real life. The Royal African Company was established in 1660 under the stewardship of England's King Charles II. It was granted a monopoly over English trade on the west coast of Africa, primarily dealing in gold, silver, and slaves. The company was initially formed to exploit the resources of the African continent, and its primary focus was on the lucrative slave trade. Its roots can be traced back to earlier trading companies, such as the Company of Royal Adventurers trading to Africa, which was led by the Duke of York, who later became King James II. The Royal African Company was pivotal in the development of the British Atlantic slave trade. Between 1672 and 1689, it transported around 100,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, primarily to the Caribbean and to the colonies of North America. These slaves were exchanged for goods such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were highly valued in Europe. The company operated heavily fortified trading posts along the west coast of Africa, in what are now Ghana, Nigeria, and Angola. The company's monopoly was challenged and eventually broken by independent traders in the 17th century. In 1698, the British Parliament passed an act to allow private traders into African trade, greatly reducing the company's control and profits. Although the company continued to operate, its role and influence in the slave trade were significantly diminished. By the early 18th century, the company had shifted its focus from exclusive trading rights to operating as a regulatory body and overseeing English activities in the African continent. Throughout its existence, the Royal African Company was a source of great controversy. It was criticized not only for its monopoly over English trade in Africa, but also for the brutal conditions aboard its slave ships and the treatment of the enslaved people. By the time the company was dissolved in the early 19th century, following the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, the Royal African Company had transported an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 enslaved individuals. Its history serves as a reminder of the grim realities of colonial expansion and the immense human suffering that the trade in enslaved people caused. Of course, the perfect narrative counter to a group of ragtag pirates would be a company composed of some of the most evil corporations ever to roam the earth, pitting the fictional East India Trading Company against freedom-loving characters like Jack Sparrow, along with truly testing the supposed civilized life of Port Royal and whether or not it was worth living for Will and Elizabeth. Now, on to the man himself. Which historical figure inspired Cutler Beckett? Well, I have a few answers. Firstly, we have Clive of India. Robert Clive, famously known as Clive of India, was a figure who was known at the time as a great British hero, but today a tyrannical villain who left a dark mark on history. His role in establishing British supremacy in India cannot be overstated, though it came at significant and horrific human cost. Robert Clive was born September 29, 1725, in Shropshire, England. His early life was marked by a fiery temperament and a defiant spirit. At the age of 18, he arrived in India as a clerk of the East India Company. The political landscape of India during this period was fragmented, with the Mughal Empire in decline and numerous local powers vying for dominance. Clive shifted from his administrative role to a military position, displaying a natural aptitude for leadership and strategy. His early military exploits earned him recognition, but it was the Battle of Plassey in 1757 that cemented his reputation. By allying with Mir Jafar, the commander of Bengal's forces, Clive managed a decisive victory against Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. This victory was pivotal. It not only led to Clive installing Mir Jafar as a puppet ruler, but also marked the beginning of extensive British control over India. Following the Battle of Plassey, Clive engaged in significant political and military maneuvering. His actions, however, were not without controversy. The Treaty of Allahabad, signed in 1765, granted the East India Company the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This right effectively turned the company from a commercial enterprise into a ruling entity, wielding tremendous political and economic power. Clive's governance model focused on maximizing revenue, often at the expense of local populations. His administration saw the implementation of tax collection systems that would later be criticized for contributing to the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, where millions of Indians died. Clive returned to England in 1767 amidst growing criticism over his wealth and the means by which it was acquired. He faced multiple inquiries, but was ultimately cleared. However, his health deteriorated, and he died in 1774 under circumstances believed to be suicide. Next up, we have Edward Colston. He was an English merchant, philanthropist, and member of Parliament, widely known for his involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and his extensive philanthropic work in Bristol. Born into a wealthy merchant family, Colston grew up in Bristol, a major port city. He moved to London as a young man to apprentice in the Mercer's Company, one of the premier livery companies in the city. He later joined the Royal African Company, and it was here that his fortunes truly began to rise. As a member of the Royal African Company, Colston ascended to the position of deputy governor, and during Colston's involvement, it was estimated that they transported tens of thousands of Africans to the Americas. These individuals were subjugated to brutal conditions, with a significant percentage not surviving the journey. Despite his involvement in the slave trade, Colston is perhaps best known in Bristol for his philanthropic efforts. He donated large sums of monies to schools, almshouses, hospitals, and churches, something he and Beckett have next to nothing in common. Colston's legacy has become highly contentious, particularly in the context of modern discussions about racism and historical memory. His involvement in the slave trade has led to calls for the removal of his statues and the renaming of buildings and streets bearing his name. The toppling of his statue during a Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol in 2020 highlighted the intense emotions and divided opinions about his place in British history. And lastly, we have Woodes Rogers, probably the biggest inspiration behind Lord Cutler Beckett. Woodes Rogers is best known for his role as a privateer and later as the governor of the Bahamas, where he was instrumental in suppressing piracy in the Caribbean. Rogers came from a seafaring family in Bristol and grew up during the latter days of the buccaneering era. Initially a merchant sailor, he turned to privateering, legally plundering enemy ships during wartime. His most famous voyage was the circumnavigation of the globe from 1708 to 1711, where he rescued Alexander Selkirk, a marooned sailor whose story inspired the novel Robinson Crusoe. In 1718, Rogers was appointed governor of the Bahamas, a position he used to implement policies against piracy. At the time, Nassau was a haven for pirates, and Rogers arrived with the mandate to restore order. His approach included a combination of force, offering pardons, and integrating former pirates into the local militia. Rogers' governance brought relative peace and stability to the Bahamas. His efforts were pivotal in transforming Nassau from a pirate's paradise to a more orderly colony. Despite facing numerous challenges, including financial difficulties and health issues, his impact on the Caribbean's maritime history remained significant. If you'd like to know more about Woodes Rogers, I'll leave a link in the description to my friend Golden Gunpowder's channel, where he covers Woodes Rogers' life in great detail. And of course, within the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, Beckett basically takes the place of Rogers. He arrives in Port Royal in Jamaica, takes command of the territory from Weatherby Swann, and offers a full pardon for Will Turner in exchange for getting the compass from Jack. In a sense, he did what Rogers did to quell piracy, pit them against each other, sowing distrust between crews, forcing them to abandon their own, and ultimately, his undoing was underestimating their loyalty to each other. Thank you all so much for watching. If you liked it, be sure to like and subscribe and comment down below your thoughts on this. Who do you think inspired the creation of Beckett the most? Which scenes with Beckett are your favorite out of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies? Let's get a discussion going. Also, if you want to talk with me one-on-one about different pirate topics, feel free to join my Discord server. I'm always open to chat, so swing by if you're interested. Also, if you want to financially support my channel, feel free to check out my merch store or donate to my Patreon page. That way I can dedicate more time to making videos for you guys. A mere $5 a month on Patreon will also get your name listed in the credits at the end of my videos. If you got some extra cash lying around, consider donating. That's all for today, and always remember, it's just good business.